Good evening and welcome to today's panel conversation on race, voice, and representation and collective memory in American culture. My name is Michael Delle Carpini, and I'm a faculty member and former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. For those of you who are new to this series, this panel is the 10th of 13 we're holding over the course of this academic year as part of the preceptorial on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. The preceptorial is designed for Penn undergrads, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. The preceptorial is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program at Penn and co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives, all as part of the Year of Civic Engagement at Penn. While inspired by events such as the murder of George Floyd, whose trial is taking place even as we speak, the trial of the person who killed him, and the resulting protests and demonstrations, and the calls for change that also emerge from them, this series of panel discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism and to identify what we have or might do to address these inequalities. I should note to the audience that you can use the Q&A function on your screens to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we'll leave time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. We have another stellar panel to address today's issue and your questions, who I will now very briefly introduce. So I'd like to please ask the panelists to unmute your videos now so the audience can see you as I introduce you. Great, thank you. Excellent, thank you. So first is Herman Beavers, the Julia Beren Platt and Marc E. Platt President's Distinguished Professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and Faculty Director of Civic House and the Civic Scholars Program at Penn. Professor Beavers teaches courses in African American and American literature, including courses on Southern modernism, 20th century African American poetry, the literature of jazz, an introductory poetry workshop in the creative writing program, and along with Professor Susanna Berger, the arts-based community service course entitled August Wilson and Beyond. His most recent poems have appeared in Mellis, the Langston Hughes Colloquy, for Philadelphia, Cleaver Magazine, the American Arts Quarterly. He recently published essays on August Wilson, Charles Johnson, Ralph Ellison, and Toni Morrison, and his latest book, Geography and the Political Imaginary of the Novels of Toni Morrison, was published in 2018. Professor Beavers also serves as an advisory editor at the African American Review, Modern Fiction Studies, the Langston Hughes Review, and the Black Scholar. Our second panelist is Margo Natalie Crawford, Professor of English, and the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Professor for Faculty Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Crawford is a scholar of 20th and 21st century African American literature and visual culture and of global Black studies. Crossing boundaries between literature, visual art, and cultural movements, her scholarship opens up new ways of understanding Black radical imaginations. Her other research interests include performance studies, comparative ethnic studies, radical feminism, and transnational modernism. Professor Crawford is author of a number of important books, articles, and essays, including Black Post-Blackness, the Black Arts Movement and the 21st Century Black Aesthetics, Dilution Anxiety and the Black Phallus, New Thoughts on the Black Arts Movement, and Global Black Consciousness. She also serves on the editorial boards of the Society for Textual Scholarship, the James Baldwin Review, and the Wiley Blackwell Anthology of African American Literature. Our third panelist is Guthrie Ramsey, the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Term Professor of Music at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Ramsey, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, is a musician, historian, pianist, and composer. Among his many publications are Race Music, Black Culture from Bebop to Hip Hop, and The Amazing Bud Powell, Black Genius, Jazz History, and the Challenge of Bebop. Dr. Ramsey is also co-author of The Transformation of Black Music, The Rhythms, the Songs, and the Ships of the African Diaspora, and editor of Ray Linda Brown's The Heart of a Woman, the life and music of Florence B. Price. As a producer, label head, and leader of the band Dr. Guy's Musicology, Dr. Ramsey has released 5 recording projects and has performed at venues such as the Blue Note and Harlem Stage in New York, and the Annenberg Theater of the Performing Arts and Chris Jazz Cafe in Philadelphia, as well as other venues worldwide. His music commemorating the 100th anniversary of the NAACP and the score of the prize-winning documentary Making Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, and his documentary Amazing, and he's also ahead of the documentary Amazing, The Tests and Triumph of Bud Powell, which was selected at the Black Star Film Festival in 2015. Dr. Ramsey hosts Musicology Podcast and Musicology RX, his community arts initiative that provides quality arts program for underserved communities. He's also written for and consulted with both national and international museums and galleries. Our fourth panelist today is Deborah Thomas, the R. Gene Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also part of the core faculty in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, holds a secondary appointment with the Graduate School of Education, and is a member of the graduate group in English, Africana Studies, and the School of Social Policy and Practice. Among her many publications, she is author of Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, Entanglement, Witnessing, and Repair, Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. She's also co-editor of Globalization and Race, Transformations in the Cultural Production of Blackness. Professor Thomas is also co-director and co-producer of 2 films, Bad Friday, Rastafaria After Coral Gardens, a documentary that chronicles the history of violence in Jamaica through the eyes of its most iconic community, and 4 Days in May, an experimental documentary that juxtaposes archives related to Tavali incursion in May 2010. And she's also co-curator of a multimedia installation at the Penn Museum titled Bearing Witness, 4 Days in West Kingston. Should add that prior to her life as an academic, Deb was a professional dancer with the New York-based Urban Bushwomen, a company that is committed to using art as a means of addressing issues of social justice and encouraging civic engagement. Last but certainly not least is Tukufu Zuberi, the Lasry Family Professor of Race Relations in the Sociology and Africana Studies departments here at Penn. Having established himself as one of the world's leading scholars of the demography of race through such publications as Thicker Than Blood, The Demography of South Africa, and White Logic, White Methods, as well as an effective and talented academic administrator through his roles as chair of the Department of Sociology, chair of the graduate group in demography, director of the African Studies and Afro-American Studies programs, and founding director of the Center for Africana Studies, Professor Zuberi turned his attention to bringing a fresh view of culture and society to the public through various platforms, public lectures, television programs, film, museum installments, interactive social media, and international collaborations with transnational organizations and individuals dedicated to human equality. Dr. Zuberi is the writer and producer of African Independence, an award-winning feature-length documentary film that highlights the birth, realization, and problems confronted by the movement to win independence in Africa. He was also a regular on the acclaimed PBS television series, History Detectives. Thank you all for being here tonight. I know you're under a lot of demand in these times that we're in, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to do this, as I know our audience does. Now, while today's panel is focused on issues of race, racism, and culture, I'd like to give the panelists a chance to reflect on any recent events, for example, the recent elections and their aftermath, the first 6 weeks of the Biden administration, or now a little longer than that, the passage of one of the most problematic retentions of voting rights since Jim Crow in Georgia, the tragic killing of 6 Asian women in Atlanta, Georgia, the Derek Chauvin trial that's taking place even as we speak and being broadcast live, or anything else related to Penn, to Philadelphia, or the nation with implications for issues of racial justice. I'll give you each a chance to just comment on anything that just is striking you and that you're thinking about it at the moment. But let me start with Herman, if you don't mind. And Herman, any thoughts on any of these issues or any other recent events, the role race has played in them and their implications for issues of racial justice?
Well, first off, thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure. I'm really pleased to be with my colleagues. One thing I was thinking about, I gave a guest lecture at Columbia last week, and we were talking about Toni Morrison's third novel, The Song of Solomon. And in that book, there's a scene that takes place in a barbershop, which is one of the most important sites of political discourse one can think of in the everyday sense. And there's a moment where a young man says, well, you know, I just came from the pool hall where they wouldn't give me a bottle of beer. And one of the barbers says, well, you know, come over here and let me tell you all the other things you're never going to have. And he proceeds to list things that start off as being pertinent to his experience as a man that worked as a waiter on the railroads. But then it enlarges to take in being able to buy a house with, you know, in cash on whatever street you want to buy it on, or owning 8,000 acres of timber, or having 3 or 4 stars on your shirt front if you're in the military. And he says, you're never going to have these things. And it's a passage that I really love, and I've loved since I first read the book. But it occurred to me during this lecture that somebody saying you're never going to have that, it resonated because I thought about January 6th and the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. From their standpoint, I'm never going to have the things that Railroad Tommy, that's the character's name, Railroad Tommy was describing. I'm never going to have those things. I shouldn't have those things. I'm not part of the human family and thereby unworthy to have those things. And I guess I think further about the fact that everything that happens in Song of Solomon happens in a segregated community. And I think people like to talk about inflection points. I'm not sure if this is that moment, but one thing is clear. Toni Morrison, and reading about Pilate and Milkman and Macon Dead, all of those things are wonderful, but following on Hazel Carby's point, if reading about Black people is the extent to which you engage with Black people, we have a real problem on our hands. In other words, reading does not substitute for interacting across racial lines. It does not substitute for leaving the community in which you are the dominant culture and entering into a community in which you're the minority, and thereby in a position where you need to listen. It's not going to substitute for those things. And so the last thing I would say is, you know, as much as I love teaching literature, I find myself really thinking about what lies beyond the text, and what kind of human interactions might we foster using the text as a springboard to different kinds of human interaction.
Well, thank you for that, Herman, and your point's really, really well taken. I also sometimes wonder how many people are actually even reading about or things by people even to begin with, but the point's really well taken. Margo, any thoughts you would like to bring up?
So I too am so honored to be in conversation with all of you today. And I've been thinking today and yesterday quite a bit about the Derek Chauvin trial, and I want to share just some opening thoughts about that. So we now know that it was 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That's the amount of time that Derek Chauvin's knee was on George Floyd's neck. It was not 8 minutes and 46 seconds. What time is it? It's Black freedom time. Yesterday, the language and the opening statements of the Derek Chauvin trial underscored for me why we must rage. We must continue to rage against the violence of the current anti-Black police system that began during slavery. And I'm thinking about language such as, used during this trial in the opening statements, language such as, you don't need to continue to use force once the person is subdued. Once again, you don't need to continue to use force once the person is subdued. Clearly, this language on the deeper registers, it makes us hear the internalization of that anti-Blackness. It should make us hear what it means to be conditioned to collude in your own oppression. And I think it should also, when we think about art and culture and the work that Black art and culture do, it should make us rehear Toni Cade Bambara when she tells us, right, that what is the mission of the Black artist if it is not to make revolution irresistible? And so what's on my mind today is the force of 21st century Black art and culture. Lately, my latest work, moving away from the 60s and 70s and continuing to focus so much on this most current art. And I think this most current Black art and culture is doing so much, but part of the force of it is to really complicate what becomes an ongoing, larger American naturalizing of a, quote, Black culture of pain. And when I say the Black culture of pain, I mean the ways in which, in thinking about what a larger culture that we might call American continues to consume in terms of Blackness, it's this idea that it's that culture of pain, which so often, if we think even about the appropriation of wokeness, woke, as we know, beginning as a most vernacular Black term, and even that appropriation of wokeness then making us hopefully think even more about how horrendous it is that this culture of pain, on the one hand, that's where we're supposed to stay as if our lives have no joy. It's simply the culture of pain. And then even that culture of pain is rendered cool when it's appropriated. So, right, when the culture of pain then slides into the Black cool. And right now, when we think about culture and art and everything else we're going to talk about today, I also think that we need to think about the appropriation of this wokeness. But let me end by saying that I think Fred Moten is my kindred spirit today as I think about pushing against that culture of pain and thinking about what's at stake as we watch, as we should, trials such as Derek Chauvin's trial, and at the same time resist forgetting Black aliveness, if I can hail Kevin Quashie for a second. And Fred Moten says the analysis of our murderer and of our murder is so we can see we are not murdered.
Well, thank you for that. That you've raised a bunch of topics, as did Herman, that I hope we can get into at least a little bit as we go to the other questions. I will say that I struggle with the very issue that you mentioned as a white person on the watching of the videotapes and of the trial itself. So thank you for pointing that out. Guthrie.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I guess I'll just enter in where I live, and that is as an artist. And just jumping off on the issue of pain that Professor Crawford just riffed on. You know, when you were speaking, I was thinking about being the organist at a funeral, and how when you are serving that place in the community where you are part of a community of faith or any community, and your role is that of an artist or of the musician, you could be feeling as much pain. It could be somebody you know laid out there. But as soon as you walk into that position, of being the person who's going to be the conduit to play things that will heal, the conduit that will sustain people through that pain, regardless of what you're feeling. I think it's a perfect metaphor for the role of Black art in this context. The only thing, I don't have anything profound to say because I'm taking in race and being racialized and racializing others constantly. I'm taking in art all the time, constantly. I'll just respond to the last thing I saw, and that was the Tina Turner documentary. And the way that that filmmaker crafted and told her life story is a great metaphor for the role of Black art in this society. Someone who was started life as a sharecropper, the child of a sharecropper, and who, through force of will, met Ike until he paid attention to her and realized her value to him. And then she grew from there into an amazing singer and dancer and entertainer. She left him and after the age of 40, when everybody had counted her out, she redid herself and became a world-class musician who could draw huge auditoriums of people around the world in a genre in which she was not supposed to be. Nobody thought a middle-aged Black woman would become a rock and roll icon in the 1980s, but that's precisely what she did. I just want to let that just hang there a little bit to say that, and I'll end by saying this, that as I said, as an artist, I'm constantly taking in what's going on around me. You can't not see what happened to George Floyd. But immediately what an artist does is try to translate that experience and our reactions to things into something that will heal people, will get them to understand it in non-didactic ways, and to also, through our teaching, get people to elevate their consciousness so they can see if they're participating in those systems of oppression, often without saying it to them directly, because we all know that we are paid a lot of money to teach people, and we're not hired to accuse them. We're hired to help them see the light. I'll just end there.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Guthrie. And I don't think you have to worry about whether you're going to be saying anything profound or not. So I think you are. Thank you. Deb.
Hi, just going to add my thanks to the chorus. It's really lovely to be here with you all this evening and to reflect together on current events and historical events. I guess I would just add that, thinking about the trial going on now, as I'm sure it did for everybody, took me back to last summer and the amazing resonance that the killing of George Floyd had around the world. And not only in spaces that we would call the global north, right? Europe, etc., but also in places like South Africa, in Trinidad, in Jamaica, where the kind of state violence that people experience on a regular basis is often not framed within the language of anti-Black racism because these are majority Black spaces. And I guess what's been so important to me as, somebody who thinks about these spaces quite a bit and about the relations between these other spaces in the United States is to really understand and to create pathways for other people to understand, whether it's students or observers of our artistic production or our scholarship, to understand that this racism is a global phenomenon, and it's a global phenomenon that is rooted in the very things that many people think are moments of progress, right? It's a global phenomenon that is rooted in modernity, and by which I mean, the coming of Europe to the New World with Africa conscripted, native dispossession and genocide, and then the transatlantic slave trade. And I think it's really, if we understand that the contemporary condition is founded on these moments of originary violence, then it becomes part of our duty as scholars and artists to really create archives of that violence and of the contemporary repercussions of that violence, because so many people disavow that. They disavow the continuation of the past in the present. That said, I guess I would also say, following on both Margo and Guthrie and also Herman, that, I think it is also our duty, but I think also our impulse to constantly build archives of life, and to constantly recognize the ways we continue to build spaces for life and for the elaboration of care and community. And that refusal of the position of the suffering slot, I think, is what's so important to me, not to avoid or not acknowledge the continued histories of violence, but also to know that we have always managed to maintain and build life for each other, and again within a global context. And I think that's what's always so important to remember.
Thank you for that, Deb. That theme that you just mentioned, and the duality of it, I want to come back to that in a few minutes. That, I think, an important point. Tukufu, what would you like to add to this initial part of our conversation?
These people have covered so much. I don't know what I can add, but I always think that's a prescription we use for talking. So I'm gonna go ahead and say what I have to say, which is, I think that the national narrative, the way we talk about the U.S., the way we talk about its history, the way we talk about what's going on in the U.S. has been hijacked by white supremacy. And they have hijacked it for a very long time. They give a narrative which tries to make everyone else invisible, and they show you that they will carry finally the Confederate flag to the Capitol of the United States if you forget that they feel very entitled to disrupt any sense of being that people who are not prescribing to white supremacy have. And I think that this is very important because, if you look at all of these white men going out, committing these mass murders of people, it becomes almost another form of this white entitlement. The attempt to justify their actions based on either their psychological state of being or a kind of mass search for something, as they didn't get killed, right, in this process. So the Taylors, the Floyds, the Rices, all these names that we could just list for this entire time that we're here are people who have been subjected to white supremacy. And it hits us in that kind of fundamental way when we see the lives that it has taken. But there's some rootization of this too. There's some ways that it has made normal. And that's what people are upset about, having statues of racists that they drive past every day, or having the names of people who never accepted our humanity as being the label for the university that we go to, or people thinking that we cannot debate the quality of a person that George Washington was, because he did own enslaved people. Indeed, he helped found the US. He was a big general and all that, but that doesn't absolve him from engaging in this dirty action against humanity. And see, the kind of white supremacist narrative that we have been experiencing tries to tell us that somehow George Washington and Frederick Douglass got to get put on the same pedestal, when Frederick Douglass never owned a slave. When Frederick Douglass went around advising presidents who were engaged in a process of celebrating their white supremacy in that process. And I really resonate with what Deb is saying in terms of the internationalization of understanding the context of this struggle, because the Black Lives Matter movement has been a very powerful movement, but it's not only been powerful in the United States, it's been powerful in London, it's been powerful in Lagos, it's been powerful in Rio de Janeiro, it's been powerful in Hong Kong, it's been powerful in New Delhi. And the reason for that is because the suffering and the misery that people have experienced around the world necessitates that kind of intersectionality that Angela Davis talks about, of movements across space and across time that we really do need to consider, so that it helps us even situate this moment if we can get beyond the national narrative, which privileges a kind of white supremacy which is grounded in the empire, which is supposed to be represented by the United States. And somehow we need to get beyond that limitation and begin to have a conversation which involves the rest of the world and involves how the comforts of the United States are dependent on the suffering that many people in the world experience, and to recognize that what we have is a responsibility to the rest of the world. It's not just what happens in your neighborhood. It's not just what happens in your state. It's not just what happens in your country. We need to be concerned about all people. And this is what we learned from all of our movements which have attempted to direct this country to a safer path. That's what we did when we won the Civil War. That's what we did when we enacted a civil rights movement, which opened the gates for people to protest in many other venues. And that's what we continue to do with our expressions of challenging institutions which foment white supremacy.
Thank you for that. I guess you were able to find something to add to this conversation, Tukufu. It was great. It was great. And you know, individually and collectively, you hit on a lot of the points that I think are central to what we want to talk about today, and especially this. What I found to be, let me just say that I found this the most difficult of the panels to think about how to structure of all 13 that we've either done or will be doing. And that's in part because the basic premise of each of the other panels, given the topics like economic inequality, like housing inequality, like issues of the criminal justice system, they were, complicated as those issues are, they were issues in which there was kind of one direction, which is the problem. The way racism has structured those institutions and those systems in ways that work against African Americans. This, you know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this feels more complicated in the sense that there's the duality that you've mentioned, the way in which African Americans have shaped American culture with what they do, shaped their own African American culture at the same time that their voices have been, their voices have been silenced, at the same time that the national narrative has either ignored or distorted that larger narrative. So it feels like we're talking about both a celebration of elements of Black culture at the same time that we're talking about the problematic way in which Black culture has not been foregrounded in what we mean by American culture, and at the same time, when it is foregrounded in a distorted way. So that's my own simplistic way of thinking about this particular moment that we're in and the issue we're trying to describe. But what I'd like you all to do a little bit now, and we can change the structure of this. I acknowledge we're trying to cover an awful lot, but I'd like to start at least with talking a little bit about that duality a little bit more. What are the ways in which, and you've all touched on this already, the way in which American culture is being represented, and the way in which African American culture is embedded or not in that? What are the ways in which it gets distorted, silenced, made problematic? But also, to the extent that you want to, what are the ways in which it continues to find its voice in variety of settings, whether it's music or art or sports or entertainment, fashion, whatever element of culture that is something that you want to focus on? How does that complicated problem of a clear overarching racism and yet still a thriving within that, for want of a better way of putting it? And you can take that in whatever direction you would like, but maybe Margo, you've made some really excellent points at the beginning that I think you could build on, but do you want to just try to take this on? What am I wrong? Am I thinking about this wrong? Is there another way of thinking about it? Oh, you're muted, Margo.
Pardon me. So it's a huge question, right? But I think that, if we think about even how we're framing the question in terms of setting apart, quote, American culture, right, from Black culture. So we could think about that frame as something that we could dislodge.
Yeah, please, right? Yeah.
And so then if I continue to think about this 21st century, most current art that's been on my mind in terms of thinking about so many of these matters, we could think about a text like Citizen, Claudia Rankine's Citizen, that is subtitled An American Lyric. Claudia Rankine's Citizen, that if there's ever a signature 21st century American literary text, it would be Citizen. I was talking to colleagues recently at Columbia, and we were talking about the fact that when Citizen became required freshman reading and so forth, we can't look at Citizen and say, okay, this is canonical African-American literature. It is a way in which even that subtitle, An American Lyric, should help us become more interested in how Claudia Rankine herself really dislodging this frame or the two frames, American lit and then African-American literature, to really bring the two together. And why? What's at stake? Surely someone like Claudia Rankine, this is no desire to celebrate what American means. I don't think at all we want to think that somehow she wants to take that word American and think that there's not so much dissonance when we place it alongside African-American, Black, or whatever term we might use. And so I guess I would say that what I think is important when we think about even this issue of, the longstanding, appropriation of Blackness by, quote, white mainstream culture and so forth, is to recognize that there's always been a way in which a really complicated Black public interiority, has been created in the art, has been created in cultural movements. And I say this Black public interiority, this sense of this desire to create this Black space, right? And this Black space that then is something that can be collective, can be most individual, and then somehow, some way also be something that is shared. I think that really becomes the mood of so many texts that literary texts that are now defining these first waves of 21st century Black literature. And Citizen would be one example, once again, of this desire to really make it so that there's such an emphasis in this text on the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, the text, as many people listening will know, it even includes the book itself, a tribute to the lives lost because of this ongoing police brutality. And each edition of Citizen, Claudia Rankine continues to update this list. So what am I getting at? It becomes, this is then this art that is fully focused on the Black Lives Matter movement. And at the same time, the book is about so much more. forever. So it means Black life unbound, going back to some of what Deb was saying about the archive of Black life, even as she makes it impossible for us to not read Citizen as also an archive of the deaths of the people who continue to die because of this white supremacy.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that again. Guthrie, give me your thoughts on this issue.
Wow, I have to follow that.
Yeah.
Okay, let me introduce another kind of duality or binary into the conversation quickly, and that is thinking about how, and particularly in the realm of music where I spend most of my time, how the kind of emergence of an African-American tradition has served as both a kind of metaphorical, figurative, and realistic space where African Americans have created the idea of their humanity in the face of, the American brutality and violence. But also one of the main places in which there has been lots of interracial interaction, from the very beginning. So you can't disentangle those two things. It's just how it has been. Just three quick examples. Frank Johnson, let's just stay with Black Philadelphians. Frank Johnson's at the turn of the 19th century was a Black musician who performed for many white audiences throughout Philadelphia, went to England, got this idea of the Promenade concerts, spent a couple of months over there, came back over, introduced it into Philadelphia, and Black and white Philadelphians were shaking their booties to his music. Okay. Richard Allen, the first compiler of a hymn book that Black people used. He was actually spent after buying himself on layaway from the man who claimed to own him. He actually went around as an itinerant preacher with Black and white congregations, throughout Delaware, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So it's always been a kind of thing where this thing we call African American culture has served these two roles. And then if you even think about Charlotte Forten, James Forten's daughter, who went to Port Royal and documented what she was hearing among the quote unquote contraband, those men and women who have been freed because the North has strategically captured St. Helena's Island during the Civil War. Her whole idea was to see these men in uniform being like white soldiers. That's what she wanted to see. So this has always been this, there's always been kind of impossible to disentangle these two things. Now, I'm going to drop into the 21st century along with you, Margo, and think about two artists that I've been thinking about recently. That is Lil Nas X and B. Slade, two Black gay men who are totally out. It's nothing closeted about them or their work. And so which this introduces, and how their work pushes against, particularly with B. Slade, who has mastered all of the tropes of gospel music to the degree where he is gospel music. Okay. And to see people kind of try to deal with his sexuality while he's, signifying the Black church sonically so strongly is just, what it costs it to, and then Lil Nas X in the hip hop world, what it brings up is that Black culture and music is not always about addressing white concerns. It's about addressing Black concerns too. It's like who we are and what are we dealing with and how we are coming to terms with, our own concerns concerning us, without considering the white gaze at all. Which is kind of like most of the art that I pay attention to tell you the truth. So I'd like to introduce those kind of three ideas into the mix here.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And I like the last point that you were making, which is, I think, part of the tension that it makes this a difficult issue in many kind of ways. Deb, your thoughts on this general topic?
Yeah, sure. So Professor Ramsey talked about the interracial sort of mingling that is prompted by Black cultural and political action. And I would also bring it to Philadelphia to talk about the city and this space, not just as a US American story, but as a broader hemispheric story, and to think about even the origin of the city of Philadelphia, which is, of course, a land grant given by King Charles II, but it turns out it's a land grant that was given to William Penn to compensate for his father's having captured Jamaica for the British Crown in 1655, right? So that connects then Jamaica and the British Empire to Philadelphia. Later, during the movement that we would come to know as the Haitian Revolution, there are many, many French planters who are fleeing Hispaniola and Saint-Domingue and coming to Philadelphia with the people they understood to be their property, who were mingling in this space with these other African-American people and rethinking their role in politics and culture. And this happens again and again throughout the modern period. And so I would also just add that what we understand as Black American culture is also part of a Black diasporic kind of cultural sea. And there is borrowing and there is communication that is cultural in terms of particular musical elements or dance elements, but it's also political. You know, we have to remember that the Garvey movement, started by a Jamaican, is the largest Black political organization in the world still today. Well, maybe it's been eclipsed at this point by Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives. But I think it's always important to keep in mind that we are always having conversations among our various communities, and those conversations, which is now booming from Broad Street into my window. I don't know if you can hear it, but those conversations are themselves the result of people moving all over the place and telling each other their stories and sharing our cultural practices and building new things.
Great, thank you. I want to follow up again on some of the points you just raised, but Tukufu.
I right before this conversation, I was in a conversation with a group of local historians in Philadelphia. And these are people trying to form a coalition about how to talk about Philadelphia history in a way that's not just catering to the tourists, because Philadelphia's a big tourism city, but this is a group of historians. Most of them cater to that audience, but they want to talk about how do we form a coalition to talk about Philadelphia history. And how do we kind of do that in a way that benefits the people who live in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia community? And for me, this question has to kind of deal with some root problems, like the colonial legacy, which is part of what I take from what Deb was just saying, is very important. But one of the ways we respond is something that Margo said earlier, which is you got to think about how do you decolonize the spaces that we even practice in. So the way that our spaces are colonized is we have a discipline called English. We have a discipline called sociology, which primarily deals with what it thinks are civilized societies and leaves the rest for other people to look at. We have created ways of thinking in the academy which are predicated on this colonial narrative being ignored. What do I mean by that? That is, the US was a settler colony from Europe. Brazil was a settler colony from Europe. Ecuador, same. Peru, same. New Zealand, same. And so you get this experience where the settler colonies help define the current moment that we're in. And there are other forms of that coloniality which have dominated the reality that we exist in. So one of the beautiful things which has come out of the expressions among Black people, among Asian people, among Indian people, among Native Americans, is a conversation about how do you decolonize this world? How do you undo this colonial legacy and take serious the lives of those who have been marginalized? And this gives rise to movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. This gives rise to all kinds of movements which are attempting to reset the conversation so that it is not set simply by the terms which are put before us in terms of white supremacy and people just trying to make it in what could be clearly defined as a world dominated by standards of whiteness. And so, in some ways, the tradition of African descendants all over the Americas and all over Asia has been to attack those things which challenge our humanity. And these cultural forms find a representation in those movements to decolonize these cultural spaces now. And that's why you hear people talking about decolonizing museums, decolonizing universities, decolonizing these institutions which have been fundamentally representatives of white supremacy, which, by the way, is destroying the planet, as well as keeping too many people dominated and oppressed and as marginalized citizens of the world. And sometimes we got to get reminded of that. And COVID just reminded us of that. That, yeah, it's a pandemic for everybody, but the bulk of people who are suffering from it are the people who are suffering from it disproportionately, right? Are those very same people that questions are being raised about their humanity, about their citizenship, about their personhood, and how they can and should participate in this world. So I think that we need to begin to think about how do we decolonize this world? How do we de-racialize this world? How do we reset the conversation so that it is not based on the terms of white supremacy, which ain't good for nobody. White supremacy ain't good for white people. White supremacy is killing white people left and right. It's a compromise of your humanity to advocate positions of white supremacy.
I really want to return to the issue of colonization and decolonization and white supremacy, because I think it's going to be relevant in a really central way to thinking about what needs to be done, which is what I want to turn to next. But Herman, why don't you weigh in a little on this?
So I'm grateful for my friend Tukufu's observations, because it reminds me of something that I've been thinking about of late, because I was asked to consult with a local school district on how to implement an African-American history graduation requirement. And one of the things that I realized in sort of the run-up to the conversation was Black people always should have been part of the conversation. As soon as we became citizens in 1865, they should have changed the curriculum to include us. Now that's absurd given how, Jim Crow racism and all of that. But my point in making that observation is that I dislike in the extreme the idea that what Black and brown people have produced is some kind of add-on to what's been produced. There's a poem that Langston Hughes wrote in the 1930s called "Let America Be America Again." Now, as Tukufu was talking, I was thinking about the fact that decolonization, to be sure, but one of the things that is really clear to me looking at Langston Hughes's poem is you can't read that poem and not think about "Make America Great Again." And Hughes, who wrote that poem some 80 years before Donald Trump thought of articulating it, Hughes actually imagines this inclusive version of America where he does not exclude white people. He makes it inclusive of everybody, and he does that by following on one of his main influences, whom is Walt Whitman. But he takes the Whitman sort of catalog poem where he talks about sort of this expansive tapestry that is America. And he says, well, look, America was never America to me. So when he says, let America be America, again, part of what he's saying is you have to think of America as aspirational, not as this thing that we're nostalgic about. And where we get into trouble with white supremacy is that white supremacy, is addicted to nostalgia on some level, and B, that in this moment where this moment of wokeness where people are saying that they are against systemic racism, well, one of the things that systems do well is to make you think that they're not in existence, that they're not working. Systems have a kind of automaticity to them that makes what happens a kind of common sense. So I want to sort of offer a few touchstones, because one of the things that I've been thinking about with somebody like Langston Hughes, but also Sterling A. Brown, in the 1930s, they're innovating the blues poem. And the way that they're doing that is to take the English language and taking iambic pentameter, which many people believe reaches its highest, pinnacle in the Shakespearean sonnet. They're taking iambic pentameter and taking it through African American vernacular, and they're having an argument, but they're not having an argument over the form. They're having an argument over, should I break the line at the caesura in the blues? It's this kind of pause, or should I articulate the whole line? The reason why that's important is because I just don't like the idea that Black people are not all the time theorizing about everything. If theorizing is speculation, then our literature tells us that Black people have been speculating about what it means to be them from the beginning. There's a line in Toni Morrison's Home, and if you'll permit me, sure. I'm just going to read it real quick. She says this: don't let Lenore or some trifling boyfriend, and certainly no devil doctor, decide who you are. That's slavery. Somewhere inside you is that free person I'm talking about. Locate her and let her do some good in the world. Now, the character that says this is an uneducated Black woman in 1954. She's not in the history of the civil rights movement. She's not, somebody that we've, other than Toni Morrison, who imagined her, we've not written down her words and put it on a building someplace. But I like the idea that this woman, that Toni Morrison could imagine this woman who says to this young Black woman, somewhere inside you is that free person I'm talking about. So one of the things that I want to sort of push against in this moment of Black Lives Matter, we did not need Black Lives Matter to imagine ourselves as free human beings. Black Lives Matter pushes back against the idea that white supremacy says that our lives don't matter. But it's not this thing that is designed to suggest that we just came across the idea, last week. We have always been thinking about these things. And so as I sort of scan the literature, I think about Cornelius Eady writing about this moment where this white woman, Susan Smith, imagines this Black man and says this Black man kidnapped her children. And he imagines this imaginary Black man and he puts words in his mouth and he says, look, when called, I come. My job is to get things done. And so part of what Eady is getting at is that white supremacy is this machine that's always producing a sort of racist imaginary that tries to pass itself off as common sense. And our literature is always challenging that. And it's challenging that at the level of substance, but it's also challenging that at the level of form. And so Langston Hughes and Sterling A. Brown having an argument over what form the blues poem should take is really important, because in the end, what they're both trying to imagine is how can we articulate our humanity in a way that is both and not either or.
Yes, I don't know. There's little else I can say to that, because I find that a really compelling argument. I'd like to turn, as I warned you all, we have surprisingly only about 15 minutes left. What I'd like to do is kind of build on what you all have suggested. I mean, I take at its deepest level the point that I think has been made by almost all of you in one way or another, that if you really want to understand the issues of race and culture in the United States, number one, you can't think of it just in terms of the United States. Number two, you need to go back to its deepest roots, which are colonialism and white supremacy. I take that. If any of you think there's something to be added to that, either in more detail or different, I'd love to hear it. But I guess my question, which is as hard as any of the things we've been discussing right now, is, are we at a moment now where there's anything that's happening that makes you feel that we may be having a chance to break through some of this? What does that mean even? Is there, what would need to be done? What role does artists like yourself and scholars like yourself play in this process? What are your hopes? What are your fears? I mean, I know my fear, which is one of the reasons why I helped organize this preceptorial, is that this is yet another moment that, go into Herman's point about one of the things about systems is that they do their work invisibly, that will fade in a way that other moments like this have faded. What should be done? And how, and is there a moment that we're in right now where something can be done? And maybe I'll start with Guthrie, and you can take that in any direction that you want, Guthrie, and then we'll give everybody a chance to talk about, ultimately what I think I'm trying to get at is, are you optimistic and why? Are you pessimistic or why?
Well, there's always room for hope, of course. You have to have that, nobody's ready to just lay over and die and let the thing roll over you or roll over your loved ones. And to the direct question of what can be done, I have to say that my esteemed panelists, I know their work, and they have been doing this work. They have been working so hard, writing books, making films, doing poetry, being activists, being global. You have to understand that when these pressure points come, for those of us who never leave the salt mine, it's sort of like, yeah, come on around, come on, yeah, there's plenty of work. Here, grab a shovel, grab a this, whatever, because we're here, we've been here, and for some of us, we've been doing this work for 35, 40 years. And so it's not a matter of, for us anyway, we're going to continue to do what we've been doing. And that is all of the things that we have been talking about. And I'll pass it on to someone else.
Yeah, but if I could just ask Guthrie, though, because you mentioned in one of your earlier comments about, and then you backed off it, is this an inflection point or not? And I totally get what you're saying about the fact that this is ongoing work. It's not new, that working and having hope at some level is an ongoing process. But is there anything that feels different to you about this current moment, or you're just going to hold off on, or I don't mean that in a negative way, but do you feel like you just should, it's a wait and see moment?
Well, it feels different. Indeed it does, but every moment feels different, as I've lived my life. You encounter different points, different things. There's the life cycle, and all that. So of course, it feels different. Things always feel different. But I'll say this, just on this one point, so I can defer to my colleagues, is that one thing I've noticed while teaching, particularly the undergraduates, is that I personally noticed a kind of general sophistication thinking about, a lot of these issues, meaning there's not a lot of times where you have to go over the fundamentals.
Yeah.
You can move on to thinking about things in more complex ways, which I think is going to be kind of the salvation for us all, is that we begin to think about the world in as complex of ways and in the complicated ways in which it presents itself, not in, as Herman alluded to, in some nostalgic, fake, phony thing that never happened, but facing the complexities. And I'm hopeful because I'm teaching students in the last year and a half anyway, that I believe are grasping things. And I'm hopeful that they will move ahead with a lot more energy than I have to change some things.
Thank you. Thank you. Deb.
Yeah, so I guess I would just build on that by saying that, I think that to look for some definitive moment as a turning point is a trap. And I think it sort of falls into the idea of perfectibility, which is, an idea that this country is based on. And I do think that, as any sort of political operative would say, that there are openings. There are moments that present themselves as openings. And if you are ready, as all of my panelists are, right, and you're doing the work already, you can seize the opening, and I think all of us are fully engaged in, and have been, and this is not new, and before us and after us also, have been fully engaged in processes, being lucky to be in this kind of an institutional setting in which we're trying to recreate the institution in our own image, and create an institution in which we can live, to create the institution we probably wish we had as students, maybe, or to at least have moments of that, and so, as the feminists say, think globally, act locally. Everybody must be working in their own space to create the kind of change that's necessary for us to thrive. And everybody on this panel, as Professor Ramsey said, is doing that in different ways, and I think that's what ultimately it's Weber, right? The long, hard boring of hard boards, that's politics. And you just keep at it and, keep making the kinds of movements that you think will create the space that not even necessarily the space that will recognize you, though that would be nice and is nice, but to create the space where you can build things together with other people that also then create more space for others to come in. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thanks, Deb. Tukufu.
Let me start out by saying, one, this is a tragic moment. We got a pandemic and we're actually seeing live so many people brutally killed by the police and all of this stuff. But this is a great moment. And I'm gonna tell you why I think it's a great moment. Floyd is not new. Taylor is not new. What's new is people got a camera and they can send it around the world and people can't just dismiss it. And so the brutal murder of the police, of the citizens who are considered disposable, is not new. And that's why that resonates in Hong Kong. That's why it resonates in London and it resonates in Lagos, is because people can connect to that. And as we connected, even in this moment of being on lockdown, people are going to the streets. I went to some of these marches in the summer and I was there. And you know what? It was interesting because I went to marches in the 60s as well. I wasn't that old, but I went. Is that this time when I went, I was surrounded by white kids screaming Black Lives Matter. And they serious. Now, that they are serious is a reflection of this moment in which we are approaching the problem in a different way. Now, to me, all of that is new. Probably like everybody on here, I give about 6 or 7 of these Zooms a week. And some of them range from, 50 people, and some of them have 5 and 7, 8,000 people on the Zoom or whatever medium they're using. And to me, that is amazing because I've given lectures where you get there and you outnumbering the people in the audience yourself. So that the fact that you've now got a medium in which the articulation of these conversations is much more broad, and people are interested in talking about ending white supremacy, and more people are engaged in that conversation, and more people are talking about decolonization, deracialization, and having more intercontinental conversations. I'm talking to people in Dublin, I'm talking to people in London, I'm talking to people in Paris, I'm talking to people all over Latin America, so that the conversation itself is larger in ways that it could not have been in the past. Now, maybe you can stop it. I don't know how you stop it. Maybe you can derail it. I don't know how you derail it because you didn't start it. And it ain't waiting for you to even do anything for it to continue itself. So these aspects of the whole thing are just another way that the modern moment is different than the other moments. So that you can have a president, you can have newspapers, you can have all this stuff still doing the lies that they've been doing. I mean, the whole question of misinformation and false news, Trump didn't create that idea. We know that we've been receiving false, fake news from the newspaper, from the modern media for years, and we have been complaining about that as a community. So this is just another kind of theft of an idea that reflects a reality that the ignoring of our plight has been part of the narrative of the media. They didn't bring up this question of police brutality. They did not start Black Lives Matter. They did not start Me Too. They did not start any of this. And so they're basically just trying to catch up to just be with the conversation. And the thing about it is they can't stop the conversation. They can't determine who's going to be in it, and they can't determine who's going to hear it. Now, they may do that. They may find ways to regulate the internet so that they can do that. But right now, they don't have that. And we need to take advantage because people are screaming that this level of democratic conversation, we want more of it. We want you museums to quit thinking you determine what's there. We want to have a say. We want you universities to quit thinking you tell us what you teach us. We want to have a say. We want to have a say in how our world is situated. And that's new and it's beautiful. And I don't know, maybe y'all don't see it, but I see it. It's an energizing thing to me. And I am so happy that this moment happened. And I look forward to where it takes us.
There so much on what you just said, Tukufu. We've had conversations on this before. And I'm glad you brought up the idea of the museum installation. You didn't specifically mention the one that you were involved in at the museum here at Penn, but that's what you did is you addressed an issue of misinformation with that. I mean, that's not a new issue. That's an issue that goes back to the early days of this museum. Your point about technology making this moment different, and digital information and communications technologies in particular, it's a great moment for me to just make a plug for our next panel, which is going to be on this coming Monday, because we're going to continue what this conversation started, but also focus more on that issue of information technology, which I share your feeling is a democratizing force, but like any democratizing technology, it has an equal amount of ability to be a totalitarian force. And all you got to think about is Donald Trump at the same time that the kind of examples you gave to to realize that. But thank you for that, and for the audience, I hope you might attend next Monday. The word has gone out already about how to register. But I want to now give both Herman and Margot. So Herman, give me your thoughts on the moment we're in right now. What your feelings are about it. Oh, you're muted, Herman.
Going back to this moment of both and, this idea of both and.
Yeah.
This is a frightening moment. I was sick at the time with COVID on January 6th. So I wasn't sure if what I was seeing on television was the product of some fever-induced flight of fancy or if it was really happening. But one of the things that we know is that there is a storm rising. It's clear. But I'd say in sort of in contradistinction to that, this is a moment when I look at African-American poetry, when I look at African-American writing in general, but I'm just going to focus on poetry, there is so much talent that is manifesting itself at such an early stage. I mean, there are poets in their 20s who are doing things that it took me to my 40s to figure out how to do as a poet. I won't necessarily name names, but or not a lot of names, but Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Bettina Judd, Frank Marshall, Eve Ewing. I mean, these are folks that are doing things at the intersection of poetry and history, and the intersection of verse and signifying, that are just really amazing things. And when you think about the impact that is having on the language as a whole, one of the things that is really exciting is when you see these sort of creative, performative acts of language make its way over into activism, and people start to use them. And I'm seeing that. And so at that level, I'm really optimistic about what's happening, because when I share Tukufu sense that I'm teaching The Bluest Eye in my class this week. And one of my students picked up on something that I've had graduate students struggle with when we talk about that book. But she picked up on this early stage of the book where Toni Morrison is riffing on the Dick and Jane readers. And she's like, look, this is about indoctrination. And so that she picked up on that as a 19-year-old sophomore who's reading the book for the first time is real reason to be optimistic about what is coming, because when you add on top of that, the fact that they are motivated and angry and stimulated and ready to take folks on, this is a moment where old guys like me get out of the way and we let them step into the foreground, and that it makes this a really exciting moment in that respect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would add, in addition to poetry, certainly film and music into that list of a terrific moment. Thanks for that. Margot, you get our last word. Because we're running out of time. So please, any thoughts you have on this topic or anything else that you would like to bring up on the broader topic?
Well, so much has been said. And I want to really echo everything that my panelists have already said. I'm so glad we're ending with this final question and really emphasizing the fact that this is a pressure point. It's an opening, as Deb said. If we seize this opening, it will be an opening, that is. And I want to channel James Baldwin when he says it is wrong to counsel despair. So that's also why I want to end by thinking about the hope. And I think, so much has been said, but what I would add within the academy itself, I think so many of us, we know it's so often the case, that people talk the talk in terms of wanting, especially when we're using the word diversity, which I think becomes so limited in so many ways. So we talk that talk about wanting a certain change, but I think the convergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the anti-Black racism pandemic has made it so then that in the academy itself, there is a heightened, more sincere desire to stop the reproduction of privilege. And I think I would really frame it in that way. The reproduction of privilege, it's so insidious. It's a way in which we are all complicit simply by virtue of being a part of the academy, and the way in which I feel that this moment, this possible opening, is making people really think more deeply about what it means. If we think about our students, undergrads, graduates, and so forth, if we think about what it means to actually say, wait, I actually want Penn, and I'm thinking about my colleagues at large, many other universities having these same conversations. We want these spaces to not simply be the space where, even when we think about Black students and the Black presence in these universities, are we simply reproducing this privilege? So when we think then about a question that we didn't get to, but the sense of what's the root cause of this ongoing crisis in terms of Black life, if we think about the fact that clearly not all of us are affected by the afterlife of slavery in the same way. So I think this convergence of the COVID-19 and anti-Black racism pandemic has made people, and I'm talking about truly, even when I think about my interest, not so much in the young white people who are at the protests and so forth, quite honestly, and I am moved by that, but I'm even more moved by the Black folks, shaped in different ways by diasporic formations and greater awareness of the fact that if we step outside of these trifling ongoing diaspora wars and really think about solidarity along the lines of who remains impoverished, who continues to be crushed by the afterlife of slavery, and how can we then, in terms of Black solidarity, champion any and all efforts to stop the reproduction of their poverty, stop the reproduction of our privilege. And so that's what excites me the most. And I would also say, because I know we're out of time, final point that I think it's so exciting, because I don't want to end by just stressing the academy. I think outside of the academy, in terms of the two cities that I remain most tied to, Philadelphia and my home city, Chicago, I think it's been so wonderful to see and be a part of small and bigger efforts by cultural workers who are actually trying to then allow Black art to remain so beautifully community-based, and also to break out of a certain type of racial segregation, and to really help certain communities to have those resources where we can continue to have that Black interiority, and also be able to know that segregation does not have to define our lives.
Well, that's great. And what you really opened the door to, I apologize to the audience for not being able to get directly, although indirectly we got to several of your questions. But one of the questions I did want to mention focused on the notion of I'm oversimplifying the question, but where does class fit into this? And I think that you've opened that door. When we talk about privilege, obviously privilege is more than economic privilege, but it includes economic privilege. And the logic and history of colonialism is also the logic and history of capitalism. And so I think I just would like to put on the table that, and I think you would all agree that as we think about these issues, both their causes and their solutions, that issue of economic inequality is always going to be an important component of that. So
I really wish we could have added in the Asian and Asian American element up to this conversation. It's over, but it's certainly a missed opportunity. I wish we could have talked about a little bit of the intersectionality, but maybe the next time.
Yeah, but let me comment on that, Guthrie, because it's a really important point. So people can disagree, but when we first put this together, we had a discussion about how wide a net to throw over the issues that we're talking about. And maybe incorrectly, and I'll take the blame for it, my feeling was that at least in my experience, that oftentimes when you cast, this is still a pretty wide net, but when you cast a net that's too wide, some of what are really important distinctions get lost. And a simple example of that is the way we talk about diversifying Penn, and we use broad stroke numbers as what that means. So, but what we have committed to, along your point, is that this is not going to be the last preceptorial. And there's already plans in the works for next year for something that does focus more exclusively or centrally. It's going to be wider than this, but centrally on the issue of Asian Americans. So your point's really, really well taken. I just didn't want to confound what are related, but also quite distinct histories on some of these issues. So Cool. Great. All right. With that, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your involvement. This was a great discussion. And thank you to the audience. Please try to attend our next panel, which will be Monday. The word's gone out, but you can find out more about it by just going to the SNF Padilla website. And take care, everyone. And I will see you down the road. Thanks a lot.